to take maximum advantage of the new basing footprints. It took until the mid-1970s for the Americans to finally float their first modern supercarrier, the USS Nimitz, the first ship with the speed, range, power, and flexibility required to make the most of the basing sites the Americans had already controlled for a generation. The United States was now not only the sole undisputed global naval power, it now floated individual battle groups that were more powerful than not only the entire Soviet Navy, but arguably more powerful than all the world's other blue water vessels combined. The Americans likely hold that distinction in 2020, although there's a healthy debate in defense circles about whether the soon-to-be operational British and Japanese carriers might prove capable of tilting the balance. During the next 35 years, the Americans gifted the Nimitz with 9 sister ships, and have recently begun deployment of an even more powerful supercarrier class. This multi-decade buildup would have been impossible in the world before 1939, when a half-dozen other significant naval powers floated battle groups and still held most of those anchorages. Any Chinese expansion that would replace, much less overturn, the American position doesn't simply begin after a long American head start, but must overcome an American naval global footprint that would take over a century to establish through force of arms. A footprint that is not replicable without complete victory in a world-spanning war that somehow manages to leave the Chinese mainland untouched. This is meant less as a slam against the Chinese, as it is a recognition of global naval realities. After all, aside from the Americans, no one floats even a single fully functional supercarrier, much less a supercarrier battle group, much less a global naval force. The next largest non-American carriers aren't even really operational. Russia's Kuznetsov appears to like catching on fire. The UK's Queen Elizabeth hasn't yet exited sea trials. India's Vikramaditya is a floating mass of technical problems, and the engines on France's Charles de Gaulle aren't powerful enough to bring it up to aircraft launching speed, except under near-perfect conditions. In fact, the next 9 largest fully operational carriers are also all operated by the US Navy. Much is made of China's Liaoning. It shouldn't be. On paper, the Liaoning has perhaps 1/7 the combat capacity of a Nimitz, and the Chinese didn't build it. The Soviets did, in the 1980s, sort of. This first-of-type vessel was never completed. After the Soviet breakup, the Ukrainians stripped it for parts. The ship then languished, rusting at dock for a decade until the Chinese purchased it. Today, it is used purely as a training platform. China's naval engineering is improving. The 001A, China's domestically manufactured clone of the Liaoning, is undergoing sea trials at the time of this writing, but there are still decades of work to go before China can float something that can compete with a Nimitz. Carrier engineering isn't rocket science. It's a lot harder. Beyond carriers, China is indeed floating an impressive number of missile frigates and destroyers that combine reach and lethality. But what the Chinese fleet lacks is operational range. Of China's 300-plus naval vessels, only 1/9 of them are major surface combatants that can operate over 1,000 miles from shore, a little less than the distance from Shanghai to Tokyo, under ideal circumstances. Ideal, as in no one shooting at them. Much less operate reliably at high speed. Much less operate as a tactically coherent group. Much less operate without air support. Most of these ships would be less sitting ducks than nicely roasted, ready-to-eat meals. With its naval order of battle limited by its small number of long-range ships, China is horrifically dependent upon the ports of others. China's only reliable ally, stretching the meaning of reliable and ally, is North Korea. As China borders North Korea, North Korean ports, not positioned or designed to support large-scale naval power projection, don't exactly help the picture. China has therefore pushed a string of pearls policy to create a line of friendly ports between the Chinese coast and areas of interest. Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Kenya, for example, serve as Chinese pearls on the all-important energy shipping route from the Persian Gulf. A big piece of China's One Belt, One Road, OBOR, diplomatic effort is to rope such countries into China's sphere of influence. The path the Chinese have followed is rather sophomoric. Beijing insists that the funds it has provided to these countries were not grants, but instead loans that need to be paid back. At the time of this writing, relations with all 5 countries have soured expressly because of OBOR, to the point that China cannot trust any of them to serve as ports in any sort of military storm. And that's before one considers the general hostility of their neighbors, most notably India, to China mucking about in their neighborhood. That leaves the Chinese with only one fully fledged foreign base, Djibouti. It is a facility over 5,000 miles from China's shores, designed to serve as an operational node to help multinational anti-pirate operations. It isn't so much that the Chinese Navy's only overseas base exists to hunt half-starved black dudes in speedboats. The point is that China had to go so far from home to find a country poor enough with few enough preconceived notions about the Chinese that it would be willing to host a full Chinese base in the first place. Not to mention that, ironically, hilariously, China's Djibouti base is possible only because the Americans perceive it as helping uphold the lagging order, and because Djibouti is so popular for anti-piracy bases that the Chinese hardly enjoy a strategic monopoly there. France, the United States, Italy, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates all operate permanent facilities in Djibouti. Carrot 3. Offer unfettered market access. There's more to a global order than guns. There's also butter. The Americans used their naval power to create a global market, but just as important, they allowed all the order's various members to access the American market with few limitations. At its core, the order was a bribe. The post-war economic relationship of the Americans and their allies wasn't anything like the sort of top-down control that had occurred in other post-war periods. Instead, it was as if the United States had lost World War II to every country, and all those countries imposed import requirements upon the defeated Americans. Such openness was extended decade by decade to any country that sought to join the order. First, the defeated Axis powers, then the neutrals, then the former colonial possessions, then communist China, and eventually, even the former Soviet satellites. For their post-American order to be suitably attractive to induce willing cooperation, the Chinese would need to replicate such open access. That's flat out impossible. In the United States, companies are primarily concerned with their bottom lines. They look after their profitability by developing, building, and selling products to consumers, whether those consumers be American citizens, foreigners, governments, or other businesses. Therefore, American firms treat borrowing as just another piece of the process, whether that borrowing is part of product development, capital improvements, technological research, or sales financing. Any loan brings a cost, with part of that cost typically including a requirement to pay the loan back. In the Chinese system, not so much. While China has become more market-oriented since the death of Mao, it is still far from a market economy. The Chinese government is willing to put a hand, and all their friends' hands, on the scale, particularly to support state sector companies or party goals, triply so in times of crisis. These interventions were meant to transition the Chinese communist economy from a rural mess on the brink of collapse to a modern state, all while, and here's the key, keeping the party in power and avoiding the massive social upheaval that has accompanied just about all transitions throughout history. It is, in the truest sense of the term, a political economy. It is a devilishly complex balancing act that involves a slew of entrenched interests, an ever-growing shitstorm of risk, corruption, and competing visions. Suffice it to say, the president's palms tend to be sweaty and greasy in equal measure. One of the party's favorite tools is to accomplish its dual ends of rapid modernization and control its dirt-cheap credit. First and foremost, when the credit tabs are on, and they usually are, the money flow enables favored companies to ignore pesky things like productivity and market forces, and input costs, whether that input is oil or copper or soy or cement or labor. Just take out another loan to cover costs and expand. Expand, expand. Even poorly connected private companies see benefits from cheaper credit, though these companies don't have anything like the bowling alley gutter guards of their more favored cousins. Second, since these firms' credit access means they view the issue of cost as largely irrelevant, they can compete in any market on price. The Chinese can, and do, buy high and sell low because efficiency is secondary to the political needs of the party, such as maintaining high employment levels. Third, there's only so much you can spend on fancy equipment and warehouses and shiny corporate headquarters. The money inevitably spills out and allows Chinese firms to acquire not simply tech and wood and workers and steel, but also other companies. The result since 2010 has been a massive Chinese corporate binge on foreign firms, whether it be to secure resources, eliminate competitors, or acquire technologies. If this fire hosing of cheap credit into companies to force breakneck growth seems rather pedestrian, rest assured, there's more. Private financing has now run amok. It now includes a mix of shady finances expressly designed to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Some, like shadow lending, are akin to illegal hedge funds. Others, like peer-to-peer or P2P lending, work a bit like crowdsourcing, but to fund personal credit cards. All of this allowed China to go from an agrarian society on the brink of collapse to the world's second largest economy in 30 years. But the Chinese development model has its downsides. Risky corporate behavior brought on by a lack of consequences, bloating of expenses, and of course, a mountain of debt that will never be repaid. Chinese GDP has expanded by a factor of 4.5 since 2000, but Chinese credit has expanded by a factor of 24. Total debt in China has ballooned to more than triple the size of the entire economy. According to Citigroup, some 80% of freshly issued private credit in 2018 globally is in China. While the Conference Board estimates productivity growth, how much you get from what you put in has declined since 2012. The Economist now estimates 3/4 of the value of new loans does nothing more than pay the interest of loans issued previously. China is spending more and more to get less and less, and it has already resulted in the greatest debt run-up in history. The rest of the world has seen, repeatedly, where this sort of expansion at all cost development model leads. Investment-led bubbles that collapse into depressions. In Japan, it resulted in 3 lost decades of deflation and near zero growth. In Greece and Italy, the bubbles generated what are, so far, the largest sovereign debt and banking crises in history. In the United States, runaway lending created Enron and the subprime lending crisis. Getting past something like this, assuming it is